Have you ever looked at someone you love and thought, why did they go back? Again. Why is she with him? Again. He is destroying her. You can see it plain as day from the outside, crystal clear, no question about it. And this person looks right at you and says, you don't understand, he's changed. And you feel this mix of anger and helplessness because there is no way to explain it through logic. It's just impossible. Here's the thing, it really is impossible to explain through logic because logic has absolutely nothing to do with it. Today, I'm going to break this mechanism down for you, piece by piece. No judging the victims, no moralizing, just neuroscience, hormones, and psychology, which will explain exactly why the brain literally, physically cannot leave, even when every part of a person desperately wants to. This is one of the most brutal mechanisms evolution ever hardwired into us. And once you understand how it works, you will never look at an abuse victim with condescension again. Let's start with the basics. What is a traumatic bond? It's not a character flaw. It's not if you love someone, you put up with anything. It is a specific neurochemical process that forms under conditions of chronic stress combined with periodic relief. Here's how it works. When you're living around an unpredictable person, someone who could explode at any moment, your body is constantly flooding with cortisol. That's the stress hormone. Your entire system is on high alert 24/7. Your amygdala, the part of the brain that registers threats, is going off like a blaring fire alarm. You are literally living in chronic fear, even if you're calling it tension or just feeling anxious. And this is where the first hijack happens. In those moments when the abuser becomes kind, gentle, like their old self, cortisol levels suddenly crash. The body receives an overwhelming signal of relief. And that relief, it physically feels like euphoria. Not because the person beside you is good, but because the threat has temporarily disappeared. Your brain reads this as, everything's okay. He saved me from danger. What danger? From himself. But the brain doesn't bother making that distinction. This is called intermittent reinforcement, and it is the single most powerful form of conditioning known to neuroscience. You think you're in love with this person. What you're actually in love with is the moment of relief that follows the pain. Those are two completely different things. And that's exactly why this bond is nearly impossible to break through willpower alone. But hold on, that's only the first layer. Because next, dopamine enters the picture. And this is where your brain starts working against you, in full force. Most people think dopamine is the pleasure hormone. That's wrong. Dopamine is the hormone of anticipation and craving. It doesn't release when you get something good. It releases when you think you might. Now watch what happens inside an abusive relationship. You never know what they'll be like today. Loving or cruel, tender or vicious. Will they say, I love you, or tear you down again? And that unpredictability operates exactly like a slot machine in a casino. That's precisely why people sit at those machines for hours on end. Not because they win often, but because they never know when they will. Variable reinforcement schedules produce the strongest addiction of any known in psychology. Robert Sapolsky, one of the greatest neuroscientists in the world, demonstrated in his research that dopamine fires hardest precisely when the reward is unpredictable. The monkeys in his experiments showed their maximum dopamine response not to guaranteed food, but to food that appeared randomly, only 50% of the time. You see where I'm going with this? An abuse victim is literally in a state of chemical dependency on their partner. Not metaphorically, physically. Their brain produces the same dopamine patterns as an addict waiting for their next hit. And when they leave, withdrawal sets in. Real withdrawal, with irritability, insomnia, intrusive thoughts, and a physical ache in the chest. So when someone says, I miss him, they don't miss the abuser. They miss the dopamine he triggered. That is a massive distinction, and understanding it is the very first step toward getting out. But there's something even darker at play. While the brain is riding this dopamine loop, The abuser is methodically rewriting your identity. And that's exactly what I want to get into right now. The word conditioning sounds harsh, but that is exactly what's happening. It's called coercive control. And it's such a systematic process that in a number of countries, it's already classified as a criminal offense, even in the complete absence of physical violence. Here's how it plays out in real life. First, the abuser builds isolation, gradually. He doesn't say, stop hanging out with your friends. He says, I just feel like Katie is a bad influence on you. Then, your family doesn't get us. Then, why do you even need anyone but me? The circle tightens slowly, quietly, like a noose. Running parallel to that, the gaslighting begins. This is the systematic destruction of trust in your own perception of reality. That never happened. You made the whole thing up. You're way too sensitive. You just have a terrible memory. Over time, the person stops trusting their own feelings. They think, maybe I am blowing it out of proportion. Maybe he's right, and I'm the one who's losing it. This isn't just psychological pressure. It literally rewires how the brain functions. Research shows that chronic gaslighting reduces activity in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for critical thinking and decision-making. The person loses their ability to accurately assess their own situation, not because they're stupid, but because their brain has been genuinely damaged by chronic stress. So by the time you're sitting there wondering, why doesn't she just leave? She no longer has the neural resources to make that call. Her brain is running on survival mode, not growth mode, not logic mode, pure, raw survival. And now we've arrived at the most important question. If all of this is true, how does anyone ever actually get out? Because the answer might surprise you and probably make you a little angry. When people say, just leave, they have no idea what the victim is actually up against in that moment. Statistically, leaving an abusive relationship is the single most dangerous moment for the victim. Research shows that the majority of homicides in abusive relationships occur precisely when the victim attempts to leave. The brain knows this. The body knows this. And so every time the person thinks about walking out, their nervous system literally sabotages that decision through fear. On top of that, leaving means dismantling what psychologists call the sunk cost fallacy as it applies to relationships. This person has invested years, emotions, their entire sense of self into this relationship. To leave is to admit that all of it was a mistake. The brain will protect the ego, even at the expense of physical safety. So what actually helps someone get out? Not advice, not judgment, not ultimatums from people who love them. First, a safe, outside connection with someone who doesn't push and doesn't rush. Second, rebuilding neural resources through stability, sleep, physical movement, a predictable environment. Third, and this is the critical one, retraining the brain by understanding the mechanism itself. When you recognize that what you're feeling is dopamine withdrawal, not love, you start relating to it differently, not fighting it with willpower, but observing it, like a symptom. Getting out of an abusive relationship is not a single decision. It is neurological rehabilitation. On average, a person makes 7 attempts to leave before they finally do for good. 7. And every single one of those attempts is not weakness. It is the brain working, painfully and slowly, to rewire itself for a new reality.